Hi there, my name is Warren. I'm one of the co-founders at 33 and welcome to another episode of the 33 vlog. I apologize for the sort of slightly grey and grainy nature of this picture, but I promise you that it will get better when we actually get into the main bit of the interview. This is just because we're in London and it's trying to be summer, and despite only being 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it's thick grey cloud out there. So what can you do? It's a bit grey in here. But it's not going to be grey in this conversation. It's going to be bright and exciting and lovely and wonderful and all sorts of other great things like that, because frankly, that's what we're about here at 33. We're about sharing the love for your body, the love for your performance, the love for great food, nourishment, nutrition, things that really flap your flag. That's what you'll find in store at 33shake.com if you are in the market for some really, really, really mind-blowing sports nutrition. But also sharing that love is what we do in these podcasts and with our content, because frankly, if we can get even a fraction of these lessons from all these incredible people who are coming on these podcasts, we can share those with you and all the other stuff that we put on our blogs and on our social. It's all about filling your mind with the good stuff that will take your life, your performance, your health and everything to a completely new level. And frankly, most of it doesn't cost anything. It's just about learning stuff and trying stuff, which is exactly, in a near perfect segue, takes me straight to our guest Zach Bitter today, because this is exactly what Zach did. Zach is a classic experiment of one. For those of you who have not come across Zach Bitter before, he is a very, very good ultra distance runner. Specializes in the 100-mile distance, and he is in fact the American 100-mile record holder. So how long do you think it took Zach Bitter to run 100 miles? Several days? Several weeks maybe. No, it took Zach Bitter 11 hours and 40 minutes. Now, frankly, given London traffic, I don't think you can drive 100 miles in London in that time, even if it's not rush hour. Zach's 11 hour and 40 minute 100 mile effort, which he did on a 400 meter running track. Can you imagine that? It's like nearly 12 hours legging it around a 100 meter running track. That's what he did. Zach is going to dig into the mindset behind doing this. His own performance journey, really how you handle running, such sort of mileage, how you look after your body, and particularly his own nutritional journey, because Zach is also very well known, for anyone who's come across him before, for being a big advocate in his personal performances of a high-fat, low-carb diet, or a ketogenic diet. And this was something he was led to experiment with after simply not finding the best results for himself in his performance, thinking, I wonder what else I can do. He started listening, he did podcasts, he started researching. He decided that improving his ability to burn fat as fuel was going to be a good way forward. It turned out to be legendary. It's been fueling him for the last 8 years. So he'll be unpacking exactly what that's all about. So frankly, this is quite enough of me going on, because it's really time now, ladies and gentlemen, to get into this excellent show with none other than Mr. Zach Bitter. Say a big Zach Bitter, thank you very much for coming to join us all the way from the other side of the pond today.
Yeah, absolutely, Warren. It's my pleasure to come on, and it was interesting. Your listeners probably don't know, but we bumped into each other on a historic route here in the States at the tail end of the Western States 100 trail between No Hands Bridge and Roby Point, which every runner doing that race is very much looking forward to. And you were running with a good friend of mine, Don Freeman, from a Trail Runner Nation that day. So it was kind of cool to see you guys out there. I think that must have been a few years ago at this point, though.
Yeah, I reckon that's got to be two or 3 years back now. And I remember when I dropped you the email, I was certainly aware that we'd met, we bumped into each other while I was out running with Don that day. He was giving me, as the out-of-towner, a bit of experience on the Western States Trail, which was a real nice kick for me to get to be able to see some of that. But it was very good to bump into you, and I was impressed at your memory. Either he teed you up with some notes, or you have a great memory, because you remembered that straight back. Not only that, you remembered exactly where we were on the course.
Yeah. Maybe that's a product of I do a fair bit of running by myself, so when I do bump into people, it sticks out in my head.
Well, look, I'm really glad we could catch up a bit now here, because I know you were in the middle of a training run then, and I'm guessing now you'll be building back up for Western States, yeah?
Yeah, actually, I'm diverting from Western States this year. I did it last year, but this year I'm going to do the San Diego 100, which is just a few weeks earlier. It's actually coming up in about a week and a half. So all my efforts have been kind of skewed towards that, but it's a similar enough type of type of course. It's kind of a trail slash kind of entry to mountain level course in San Diego, and it kind of sits in the shadow of Western States, so it doesn't always get as much attention, but it's a pretty cool setup there. And my wife is doing Western States, so I'm all hands on deck, crewing and pacing on June, was it 28th, I think, this year. So that will be here before we know it as well.
I was about to say, you must know the trails and the courses out there pretty well. I was just having a little flick through your resume on ultra sign up, and I recommend anyone who thinks ultra running is a short-term thing, or you can't run that many races back to back, should go and just take a flick through what you've been up to on ultra sign up there, because that is a long list of races. But there's I see a lot of West Coast, a lot of Arizona. It seems like there's a lot of stuff you've done in that area. You must know the routes out there pretty well.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like as the certainly on the trail side of things, as the sport has kind of grown here in North America, the West Coast and the Southeast has probably maybe got a leg up in terms of, certainly in the terms of publicity. So a lot of those races are well known, and it just ends up being where a lot of people kind of head out to do some races. Not to say there aren't great races out east or in the Midwest. There's ones there as well. But it seems from a destination standpoint, a lot of times people head west. And I live in Phoenix, Arizona now too, and we've got a race organization here in town called Aravaipa, and they put on something like 34 events a year. So I'm certainly spoiled where the question is usually, is it worth doing a 30-mile long run, or can I just jump in one of their events and use that as a training day?
Nice. We actually stopped by with Jamil Aravaipa when we were in Phoenix cool. last, probably about the same time when we'd have seen you. And we went to one of their races. It was like an all-night thing on a loop in the desert. And that was a fairly...
Javelina, probably.
Was it? It could have been. It ran all night. And we were sort of busy doing some work and got some laps in at the end. And that was nice running through the desert. But I can imagine the desert at night versus the desert in day. Those are two different places to be running, right?
Yeah, it's really funny actually, because if it was Javelin you're out for, that's kind of an interesting one, because it's in like October. So October in the desert, you can get anything from triple digits, like 100 plus degrees Fahrenheit, or you can get really cold weather. And at night is when you're going to get the big difference. So you might have a day where it hits almost 100 degrees or in the mid 90s during the heat of the day, but then at night it gets down below 60. And you get this weird polarizing effect if you're going to be out there all day, where you just get so warm, you're focusing on cooling and staying wet during the day, and then you kind of forget that you have to also be ready to get cold. And I think that's where people sometimes pay the price. And in fact, I think it was 2 years ago, Jamil started using long sleeve shirts as their kind of race packet thing. And I was wondering, I'm like, well, here we have a desert race. Why are you giving it long sleeve shirts? And he said, because everyone's preparing for the heat, no one's preparing for the cold. So if someone really misses the boat and brings no warm clothing, at least they've got one long sleeve sheet at their drop bag.
That's some good planning, and I think it's another good heads up for anyone out there who is traveling through Phoenix and you want some trail running. Go and look up Aravaipa, because certainly from what we saw, really well run organization, nice guys, and very good runners with it.
No doubt.
Yeah. So, okay, now one thing you mentioned earlier, I'm just going to pick up on that straight away. You said one of the reasons that you remember bumping into myself and Don on the trail was because you do a lot of your running alone. A lot of people, particularly those who run less or maybe non-runners, think running is a punishment and you need to do everything you possibly can to take your mind off it, whether that's running with someone or keeping the headphones in or whatever it is. Why do you choose to do most of your stuff alone, and how do you manage that balance of keeping your engagement during running, and how would you explain that, particularly to people who find that weird?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I do a lot of my training solo is kind of multifaceted. It's not that I'm trying to avoid people. I love running with people, and I do notice when I'm out there day after day by myself, I really look forward to getting into a group run or running with a group of people, because it kind of really, adds a new dynamic to it. But one of the reasons I kind of started doing that too was I found out years ago that I can kind of kill two birds with one stone if I listen to podcasts while running. So a lot of times I'm trying to either learn something or find out something more about a topic I'm interested in by kind of plugging in the headphones and listening to a podcast while I'm running. And So that's a pretty big part of it. And the other half is just life routines and stuff. It's tougher as you get older to kind of find a time of day that works for everyone because everyone's got a different job and maybe a different shift. And I work partly for myself, and the stuff that I have an immediate boss for is still pretty much self-planned stuff. So I can have a lot of flexibility as to when I run. So I tend not to operate on the polar ends of the spectrum, like getting up super early or running later in the day. I tend to kind of get out, I guess, in the maybe more traditional work start time. I might still be out there running, so sometimes that means going by yourself. Uh, but yeah, and I also kind of just like the ability just to kind of like, here's my goal pace or here's my goal effort, and running with yourself, you can really fine tune that to be exactly what you want, as opposed to having to try to like go with whatever pace the group decides to do.
Yeah, no, it's a good point that when there's a focus, it's whether the pace is certainly at other levels may be different at your level, but if the pace is not the pace you're looking to run, whether it's faster or slower, that makes it different. But if it's a social run, that's a different thing altogether as well.
Hmm.
Now, one thing that we should probably get up front, and that this I know I'll have mentioned this in the intro already, but there's no getting away from the fact that you are the American 100-mile record holder, and that you did knock out 100 miles in 11 hours and 40 minutes, which, when I did look at the numbers, that is essentially 4 back-to-back 3-hour marathons for anyone out there who's trying to work out roughly what that means. I'd like to go into some of that in a little more depth later, but before we go into that, just simply, where do you think the limits are in ultramarathon running? Because it is relatively such a young sport where so much is unknown, and there's been a great surge in runners like yourself coming through and pushing boundaries and doing things like that 100-mile record. Do you think there are still more boundaries ahead, or do you think we're hitting a plateau? What's your view of it from your end of the sport?
Yeah, I find it really interesting because here in North America, the trail scene really grew in the last decade, and the kind of road or flat ultra scene has just been a little slower to grow. So we haven't quite seen as much of the what I guess you would call like elite talent in the depth that we do at, say, like a race like Western States come down and see how fast they can run 100 miles when the environment is perfect. So for me, I've been kind of at least judging pacing and judging targets on folks who are kind of doing this stuff in between the 80s and like the late 90s, essentially. And those are kind of the time metrics I'm trying to gauge off. And those guys were certainly super talented when you look at some of the PRs at just a variety of distances of guys like Don Ritchie and in that group coming through doing when kind of flat ultras were kind of more targeted, or at least in North America, there was a phase where people didn't know that trail ultras existed, I don't think, and the ultras that did get any attention were some of these like flat 50-mile road races, or these 100-mile time, or these timed events like 12 hours, 24 hours, and things like that. And we're starting to see that kind of grow here as well. The interesting thing is, like, especially with the 24-hour event, we're seeing the women really take that on, and like our women's 24-hour team heading into Worlds this year is just absolutely stacked. So it's cool to see them really gravitate towards some of that, and really take it on. And I think we're going to start seeing more guys take some cracks at some of the flat 100-mile stuff in the coming years, and I'm very excited to do that because or see that and be part of it, because I think that there is a sub 11-hour 100-mile talent in the sport right now. And I think it's just going to be a matter of getting a couple or a few guys really going for broke and seeing who kind of outlasts or who has that really special day. And I think we will see that in the next decade or so, is that 11-hour time cracked in the 100 miles.
I still, whereas I know it's something you've mentioned on podcasts before, it's not an unfamiliar theme. If you have any experience in ultra marathons or long distance endurance events, then you start to frame things through what you get used to. And it can seem that 100 miles is not really such a big deal anymore. Never takes away from it being huge. But then you step outside that. an 11-hour 100-mile, that would effectively be what, kind of 4 back-to-back 2-hour 50 marathons, give or take, to parcel it up.
Hmm.
That to me seems beyond superhuman. I mean, I'm sure it can be done, but that seems to me to be knocking on the door of, well, can we get under the 2-hour marathon? It seems to be a bigger barrier than that. But you reckon that's something we could see over the next, what, 5, 10 years?
Yeah, the way I look at it is I think I think my best 100 miler is yet to be done, and I hope to to prove that. But I think I can get down in the lower 11-hour range if I have a really good day, and some of that's just based on, the amount of training time I have available in terms of looking at data, as well as a few events where I feel like if I could just fine tune a few more things, I could shave some time off. And I don't see myself as the most talented 100 miler or the most capable 100 miler in the country. So there's guys who I think if they really put the amount of tension that I do to flat 100 miling, we'd see another level come in. And that's not even including guys who aren't even in the sport yet. Another thing we're starting to see here in the United States is that we're getting more guys who are capable of or have run like a sub 2:15 marathon, get curious about the trails, get curious about ultra marathon, and not looking at it as this like death jog type of mentality that we kind of saw when the sport first rose to prominence. They're starting to see a legitimate career being available to them, and they're starting to see like some of the similar race tactics and some of the similar environment that they grew up used to when they were racing in high school and college, and in some cases semi or fully professional, marathon and below distance stuff. So I think with a lot of that stuff, it's just getting that talent pool as deep as possible, and then you just get these deep fields where in order to win, you kind of have to operate a little bit outside the comfort zone or outside the box. So you're just gonna have more guys taking risks, and the more we see that comrades every year, you get like dozens of guys running what would possibly not be indicative of what they're capable of. And most people blow up, but then you get one or two that just have the race of their life, and then we see those records get broken, and big course records and PRs get set from just the depth of the sport and the willingness to kind of reach for or shoot for the stars, I guess, essentially.
So if it was to put it into a motor racing analogy, you'd be looking at effectively win or bin, as in you're going to win it or you're going to not finish at all because you crashed. And that is probably a sea change in ultramarathons, in that there wasn't the depth of field, and there wasn't, for many people it's a finish. A win is one thing, but the idea that you would go so hard that maybe you're not going to make the end, but if you do, you're going to make history, is a very different approach, don't you think, in distances so long?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, is the Western States 100 here in the United States. Like you kind of have to decide, from my experience going into that race, do I want to target a win there, or do I want to target a top five? Do I want to target a top 10? Because that's going to be that's going to influence kind of the way you end up racing it. And in most other 100 milers here, it's the depth is so lacking relative to that, where you have to ask yourself, do I go for it and try to like run my absolute fastest time, or do I play it a little safer and say guarantee a win or guarantee a podium or something like that? And really, there's only one guy I would say in North America right now who could theoretically go into Western States and say, I'm just going to try to match the next fastest guy's pace and then do only what I have to do to win, and that's Jim Walmsley. And I think he showed us that at Western States last year by beating the field by an hour and a half. He clearly didn't need to beat everyone by an hour and a half, but he did. So he's a little unique, though, where I think you're going to get 100% of Jim no matter what the field looks like. So it's why he's exciting to watch. And similarly on the women's side, Courtney DeWalter, I think, was an hour and a half ahead of the next fastest person at Western States on the women's side. So she's certainly been an inspiring person to kind of pay attention to from this side.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a ton of spin-offs from this that I want to go into, but before we do, I just want to step back to you're talking about the difference there, the flat 100 milers and the trail 100 milers. Just for people who are not familiar with the concept, can you just explain like your 100-mile record attempt or any future ones you did? on a flat 100 miler? What would the format of that race look like? How does that play out?
Yeah, so a lot of them are on like a loop course. So usually that ranges from maybe about a mile in length to as short as a quarter mile on a track. Um, the one I've done more on a track than anything actually, which I think that's some of the surprise to a lot of people is like, why would you go out on this loop and do 402.5 laps around it in order to get to 100 miles when there's so many other areas to potentially do it in. And some of it just comes down to the mentality of chasing a specific time or seeing how fast you can do something without basically trying to minimize any physical barrier that would come in the way other than just your own forward momentum. Whereas on the trails, you're more or less responding to the physical barriers, and that's kind of part of the challenge. So it's just a little bit of a different mindset. And with the flat stuff, I think it's you know you it's interesting because it looks on paper to be easier, and there's certain things that are logistically it's about as easy as it gets. You have like one person crewing for you and you see them every 400 meters. So that's certainly nice. Like if I need something, I just say it and 400 meters later I have it, and even if we screw it up, it's just another 400 meters to get it. Whereas if you go out to any of the trail 100 milers, you mess up in an aid station and you might have to suffer for an hour before you can remedy that situation. And by then you may have dug yourself into such a big hole that the day could be compromised to the degree where you're never going to rebound from it. So that's kind of the relative advantage. The relative disadvantage is the sheer mental monotony, and then the mechanical monotony too. Like you're running around a 400-meter track, your mechanics are going to be identical from the first second to the last. Whereas you run 100 miles on a trail and you're going to have undulation from side to side, you're going to have up, you're going to have down. So your legs are going to kind of get hit from a multiple different angles and kind of just spread out that difficulty or those sore spots, so to speak. So you always kind of have a break from one type of running. If I spend a couple miles running uphill, I know eventually I'll get to the top and then be able to change my mindset, change my mechanic. Whereas when you're on the track, you see that first loop and you've seen the entire course. So you have to really get good at kind of placing your mind somewhere other than the event itself when you're running some of these track type races or these loop courses, but not so far removed that you fall away or that you're not aware of kind of how your pacing is going if you're chasing a specific time or distance in it. So it's really kind of like when I hear people say like, oh, I love this one, but I hate the other, or vice versa, I always think, well, you kind of just got to look at it as two different events. And once you get yourself into the headspace of that specific event, you'll start to see kind of the nuances of it, which make it kind of intriguing. And I just think I really like that variance. And for me, I kind of got into flat 100 milers or flat ultras in general because I really bought into the concept or the training philosophy of specificity being key with ultra marathons. The environment is huge with that. So if you can train as close to race day environment, both weather, both terrain, and all that sort of stuff, the better prepared your body and your mind is going to be for that event. So living in the Midwest most of my life, I just had a lot more access to flat stuff than I did steep mountain climbs or anything like that, or technical terrain. Now I'm out in Phoenix and we have a variety of everything. So I've been kind of dividing my year into two halves more or less, and I'll focus more on some of the trail stuff for half the year and then some of the flatter stuff the other half of the year. And I really like that because when people think of ultra marathons, they a lot of times think of like physical burnout, but they're not necessarily thinking of the mental burnout. And the quickest way for me to kind of refresh the mental approach to training and racing is to change the environment I'm going to race in, because then the way I prepare is going to be different enough that I see some of those new kind of improvements or new gains that are really motivating from kind of starting from scratch again, so to speak.
A bit like shifting things up in weight training or something like that. You almost surprise the muscles into doing something else. If the body does the same thing over and over, it will find the most economical way to do it, and your gains will be reduced because you're not you're not stressing yourself as much. So are you saying that by swapping between prep for a track ultra versus a long trail ultra, you're doing that? You're almost surprising the body. The body can't get comfortable with one thing, so it has to constantly keep adapting, which must keep you on an upward trajectory.
Yeah, and I think too, like if I step away from the flats and some of the speed work that is more traditional to those environments, and start doing some more trail stuff and some steep hiking even, I'm going to start to lose some of that relative fitness on that environment of the flat. So then when I do go back to that half a year later, I'm starting a little bit, I've essentially kind of gotten defit to a degree within that area. So then when you start up, you kind of see those gains creep back in, which are motivating. And I think it's just good too to kind of give your body a more holistic exposure to the different types of efforts as well, just to stay kind of strong on a variety of different environments over the course of your life, as opposed to being like super one-dimensional.
Yeah, and it's got to be better for longevity, you would hope, because one thing that we've also seen, or that has become apparent as more records are being broken in ultras, people's careers appear to have, there have been a number of people who've had very high profile short careers, in that it's almost like boundaries have been overstepped, or stress fractures start to come in, or persistent injury takes them down. And even though we're not at the limits yet, maybe the boundaries were overstepped too far for that person without them really knowing about it for a while. How do you, as someone who's been doing ultramarathons for at least a decade now and very much at the front end of the pack, how do you look at maintaining that longevity while also pushing the boundaries and looking at life, well, to winning races today, having a long career, but also, running around long into your 70s and 80s?
Yeah, and that's been a topic that I've been interested in basically from when I first started ultra running. I think it's multifaceted, as most things that end up getting that complicated are. But I do think there's some very, very strong components to it. And one of them is nutritional. And then the other one would be just kind of your background within endurance sports. So the unique thing I think about ultra running is the community is so inviting that it's very easy. Like if you're not a runner, but like being outside and like being active, and you get brought to an event by a friend and you just fall in love with it overnight, it's really easy to say like, well, what is everyone doing to get ready for these things, and seeing everyone's training plans and trying to kind of replicate their process right out the gate for you, without maybe necessarily paying attention to how long they've been doing it and how long it took them to kind of normalize the training volume and training intensity and race frequency that they're actually doing. So one thing I'm really interested in is when you see like some of these guys doing big training blocks and racing frequently, a lot of times you look at kind of their background, and it's not a situation where they just started running a year ago. It's a situation where they probably started doing some cross-country track meets in middle school, and then ran in high school, maybe even competed in college, maybe even did some marathon circuiting for a while. So by the time they get around to doing ultra marathons, they've got a decade plus of slow build or slow base progress building under their belts. And then sometimes you'll see folks jump into the sport later in the game and maybe try to replicate that higher volume, higher intensity, frequent racing strategy as some of these guys and gals who have that background. And to me, you're really rolling the dice there. You're asking a lot of your body to go from not being an endurance athlete to running, say 100 miles in a week during training. You could be asking your body to kind of give out on you. So I think that's part of it, but I also think there's a big mental component there too. As it's not easy to stay mentally focused all day long, and if you find yourself really digging deep time and time again, it can be hard to kind of keep that desire there, especially if you've met a lot of the goals or exceeded a lot of the goals you ever thought you were capable of. It can be more difficult, I think, for folks to continually to mentally want to push themselves to that level. And I think that's where most of the quote unquote burnout that we see in the sport is coming from. I don't think that there's very many cases of complete like endocrine system failure or, just physical deterioration that keeps people from the sport, minus, just chronic injuries, which is clearly a physical thing. And we do see that in the sport as well. I think that's probably more to do with just either poor mechanics, neglect of some of the tertiary things to keep your body healthy outside of the running activity itself, and then a very heavy muscle component or a very heavy nutritional component that I find. And one thing I've learned a lot more this last year from my own podcast that I co-host with this guy named Dr. Sean Baker. It's called Human Performance Outliers Podcast. And when we started it, we didn't necessarily know what direction we were going to go. I actually think we initially thought we'd probably interview more athletes than anything. But as we kind of went down the rabbit hole, we ended up bringing in tons of professors, tons of doctors, exercise phys folks, like people who really have a good understanding of nutrition, training, and things like that. And just recognizing how big of a component like high quality protein plays in the recovery of your muscles as well as your bone density. I think people sometimes overlook that and they don't necessarily connect that to like why they're continually getting stress fractures or continually hurting ligaments, tendons, and injuring muscles and things like that.
And so, from a nutritional standpoint for you, I mean, for a long time, if people have heard about you before, they would likely have come across the 100-mile record, some of your other races, a number of the wins that you've had. They'd probably have come across the fact that you're well known as fairly high on the keto side, big into burning fat, very low on carb. How's that process evolving for you now in terms of what you feel your body needs nutritionally? And how that's balancing out with your results and what you're experiencing. And also just a little bit about your journey on that. I mean, how does your nutritional journey play out? How are you different now to a decade ago?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because when I started ultra marathon running for the better part of a few years going into that, which would include like my collegiate running, as well as, a couple of years before I really started doing ultra, but was really building up the volume of my training. And then my first year and a half of ultra running, I was following what you would typically see, like a typical high carb, moderate protein, moderate to low fat intake. And to put maybe some more data points on there, I was probably hitting maybe 60 to 70% carbohydrate intake, which is what you're going to see in most exercise phys literature. You're going to see in most endurance protocols. They're going to be heavy on the quote unquote healthy carbohydrates, so the fruits, vegetables, grains, and all that sort of stuff. And I did that, and it didn't seem to be an issue of, at least not at the point that I recognized it, an issue of my body is physically breaking down during a workout or during a race itself. I was noticing a lot of other things occurring outside of the actual running itself. So, for example, when I first started kind of getting into ultra marathon, I was in my mid 20s. And one thing I started to notice was the further and further I got into the sport, the harder it was for me to sleep consistently. So I went from someone who, as a younger, like in high school and college, I'd go to bed at night and 8.5 to 9 hours later, I'd wake up. And that slowly evolved into I'd go to bed and 3-4 times a night I'd wake up, and when I would wake up it would take me 15, 20, sometimes 30 minutes to fall back asleep. So I found myself in this really awkward phase where I would be planning like a 10 plus hour block of time just to make sure I would get 8 hours of actual sleep. That was a red flag in my mind as something that wasn't sustainable. I was at that time I was a full-time teacher, so I was very much tied to the school year schedule, and I would just notice that I would have these pretty big ebbs and flows of energy levels just doing day-to-day tasks. So like I might be really energetic for part of the day, and then kind of in the mid-afternoon feel like I could go down and take a nap right on the floor if I could have. And that's just a difficult place to be in when you're trying to interact with, say, middle school students who are very high energy and very on top of their game in terms of noticing whether you're feeling good or not. So a few things that I thought were just not very common for someone in their mid 20s to be experiencing. And, it was easy for me to first think well, my lifestyle is clearly unsustainable, clearly a full-time teaching job, training to the level I was, and I was training heavily. So that was certainly a component of it.
What sort of mileage or hours during a week would you be putting in on top of a school working week, which is that's a full working week?
Yeah, so it would ebb and flow a bit depending on where I was in the season, but on average for the course of the year, I was probably hitting around 15 hours of training per week. I would peak up to maybe 20, and then on some lower base building phases, in the early stages, it'd be down maybe near 10, but 15 is probably a safe number. Another way to look at it is basically over the last decade, I've averaged about a shade over 5,000 miles a year. So we're looking at, on average, even with rest days included, an average of over 100 miles per week. So I definitely feel fit into the high volume training philosophy. And so it was an interesting kind of crossroads for me, because I knew from historically that training methodology worked well for me. If I could stay consistent within that, I would feel the sharpest come race time. So I didn't necessarily want to kind of take that component out of the equation right away before I knew what was kind of going on. So I kind of got lucky in the sense that what we were talking about earlier about kind of listening to podcasts while running, around that same time, I had kind of just taken a glance at my training program, and I think I had the same idea that you did, like, well, here's a full-time job plus 15 plus hours of training per week. Where is the time for that? And then what else, if anything, can you do? And there's a level of guilt there for sure. Like when you look at that, you're like, is this really worth it? Is this really what I should be investing essentially a part-time job worth of time into? And for me, podcasts kind of were the coping with that. If I could learn something while I was running, I didn't feel like I just spent, say, 2-3 hours just running. Like, oh, I learned a few things. So I kind of paired it up with, well, if I wasn't running, I'd probably be, maybe watching a documentary or reading a book or something like that. So to a degree, I was kind of able to kill two birds with one stone by doing that. And so around that same time, I kind of got fortunate. I got interested in kind of like the nutrition side of things. And I just started listening to a lot of podcasts that dealt with sports nutrition. And that's when I first came across kind of the high fat, low carb approach to training, and came across guys like Dr. Finney and Dr. Volek, and was fortunate enough to have met them and collaborate with them throughout a variety of different things over the years, and really kind of, I guess, approach it the right way. To kind of go back to my story before, one of the reasons why I kind of stuck with that, I've been doing it for, I'll be at about 8 years come this fall. One of the reasons why
on the high fat, low carb type protocol, yep, alongside your high volume. I mean, just as a little addition, I love that idea that you are almost fueling your training by also maximizing the use of that time, because you're still living in the real world as well. It's a bit of both. And I think for many people, whether it's the commute or whether it's the time in the car or whether it's the time in the shower, there's so many portions of the day where audiobooks, podcasts, TED Talks, whatever it is, it's so easy for us now to fill our minds with really good stuff and to be nourishing ourselves up here, mentally, by the way, for anyone who's listening to the podcast, I'm pointing at my head, there's something in there. To be able to nourish your mind as well as nourish your body. But you used that as a lever because you felt a guilt that, should I really be putting so much of my life into this while I also have a job and a social life and everything else? And I just found that fascinating that you put those two things together and actually got really a double bang for your buck out of what was a large training protocol.
Yeah. And I think too, it's like, it certainly becomes a little more alarming when you start recognizing your body kind of breaking down or not optimized to the level you want it. Because then you start asking yourself, well, not only is this justifiable from a time expenditure standpoint, but if I'm also driving myself into the ground by doing it, then, it's like two mistakes at that point instead of one. And then it becomes a little less forgivable. But so for me, like, the real like kind of aha moment came when I first implemented my first go of kind of a higher fat, lower carb approach. And I was thankfully aware enough that the best time to do that was kind of on an off season, or at least during a phase of the training where you're not focusing much on intensity and the volume's a little lower. And if anything, you're just gradually building some volume. So I dropped it in kind of around that time of year, like after I'd finished my last race for the season, and I wasn't tied to hitting any specific metric from a training standpoint, and just let my body kind of really get used to it before I dove into any real strict regimental training program. And one thing I noticed really quickly was my sleep improved almost immediately. And that's not to say that everyone's going to have that same experience. You can, if you scour the interwebs, you can find people with the opposite situation where, they switch to a different nutritional program and all of a sudden they can't sleep anymore. So it's not a guarantee. That's just what kind of happened with my experience. And I've had other folks that I've worked with have the same experience too. So it's, in my opinion, worth exploring if you do struggle with that. The other thing I noticed was just the energy levels. I didn't feel like I was like jumping through the roof all day long or anything like that, but I felt like, when I was doing day-to-day tasks, I just had a constant form of energy. I wasn't having these big dips. It was more of a level um, energy output, I guess, or like sense of like uh, ability to kind of get through just day-to-day tasks, which was really nice. I enjoyed that, and as I kind of continued training, like the first month or so, it was kind of this weird kind of duality where one day I might feel really good, and I was just running basically base miles at that point. I wasn't doing any workouts, any speed sessions, so just kind of spinning the wheels more or less. And then maybe one of the other days I'd feel like I was running quite a bit faster than what the time would indicate. And that kind of oscillated back and forth for about a month before it normalized. And then basically all my base miles were back to where they were normally. And then it was just, it felt like I could run all day. And if I had water and electrolytes available to me, I didn't really need to fuel on that intensity. Uh, and then it got really interesting for me as I kind of built into my next training program. Because once I did get my volume up to peak, and once I did start introducing some more speed sessions or yeah, speed sessions essentially, I did notice that like keto or high fat is likely um, ill-defined within the endurance sport world versus say like the therapeutic world. One of the biggest mistakes I see people who are interested in this is they'll do their research and find out some kind of basic guidelines, and a lot of them will find like a metric of 30 to 50 grams of carbohydrates per day is what's going to get you into ketosis. And that's likely the case for folks, and maybe they're going to the gym 3 times a week or something like that, but really much beyond that, they're using it for other purposes. So when you really switch the lifestyle up to where you're introducing a high charging athlete's lifestyle versus someone who's a little more sedentary or looking at it from a therapeutic standpoint, you kind of have to move those metrics a bit. So, a lot of times what I find is when people are doing like an endurance training program, I think it's beneficial to start out really strict, some of those strict parameters, and let your body kind of adapt and reset towards that. But then once you kind of get back into the flow of your normal training program, I think if we're looking for a metric, I think like 100 to 150 grams is probably a better starting point when you're in the full swing of things to kind of see what your body needs in that lifestyle context. That's just the way it's been for me, and that's what's worked well with folks I've worked with in the past too. And you can always flex up and down from there. It's not necessarily an absolute where this is what's going to work for everyone. And then the other question always comes up to is like, well, what is our focus here? Like, is our focus performance? Is our focus weight loss? Is our focus just longevity in the sport? Like, what are we looking at? And, because I think a lot of people want to look at it black and white. Like, I'm either a fat burner or a sugar burner, or am I either fat adapted or not fat adapted? And the reality is it's a sliding scale more than it is an absolute all or nothing. So the question I always ask folks I'm working with, and the question I ask myself before I take on any training block is, well, how fat adapted do I need to be in order to maximize my performance? So that might change, and it almost certainly does throughout endurance sports. And that's another thing I always get a good laugh at is like someone will say like, well, high fat, low carb doesn't work for endurance, or endurance is a carbohydrate dependent sport. And it's like, well, we really need to unpack the word endurance before we even begin that conversation. Like, are we talking about the 1500 meter? Or are we talking about a 24-hour race? It's like, are we talking about an Olympic medalist, or are we talking about someone in their 40s who's trying to get back into shape? These are all very important questions to ask. And ultimately what I tell folks is if you see someone giving an absolute saying, well, this is the way you have to go, or if anyone said that wanted to do this approach for performance, and I would tell them if you do that, it's a guaranteed failure, that person's an absolutist. And you want to be very wary of what they tell you, because they may be smart, they may have a really good program, but they're going to miss people who kind of, especially people who are towards the fringe of the bell curve, so to speak. So I think you have to really keep an open mind with it, and ultimately try not to fixate on the approach as being the guiding light as much as your what your body's telling you, what your performance is telling you, and things like that. And also keeping an open mind that you're doing it the right way. I work with folks all the time who were probably about ready to quit the approach. And then when we went over what they were doing and kind of found a few points that were maybe potentially, sabotaging their attempt and adjusted those, all of a sudden they were like a light switch went off. So it is another thing too, where I think you want to take it seriously and you don't want to just kind of say, oh, I'm going to try this for a couple of weeks, and then if it doesn't work, I'll go back to my old way, and if it does work, I'll stick with it, because it seems like there's a little more individual component that you have to be willing to play around with. And I think that goes for any lifestyle or nutritional change. You need to be mindful of the adjustments that are going to be required for that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's tons in there, and just sort of mindful that not everyone will be fully up to speed on all this, because, we went fairly deep in some stuff there. But just to break out the first part, in terms of you basically finding your performance is plateauing, you're not totally happy with where you are, you're in your 20s, whereas you're balancing a high workload and a high training load, it doesn't feel like your energy or your sleep are really where they should be. So you start researching around podcasts to find, can I find some different things? Or I think that's the first step for anybody who, at any level, who has a performance issue in their health, well-being, their life that they're not happy with. Go and start learning about it, right? Go and get yourself informed. Now, you can start learning. The next step is, if you find something that, for whatever reason, is attractive to you and feels like it could be a good answer, now you've got to experiment. If you're happy with what you're seeing, right, I'm going to go and experiment. And you chose that time when you were out of the race season, you're into a kind of base period, so this is, at the most basic level, it's never try anything new on race day, right? It's when can I afford to take this change? Now, for someone with a busy job and 3 kids, it might be, well, I'm not going to do it in the middle of the summer school holiday, because like the kids are going to be eating dinner with me every day. If I want to change my nutrition, then it's just not going to happen. But whatever it is, find a space where you can experiment. You then did that, but then you go out there, and this is where we get into the world of, on the one hand, science says X, Y, Z, and if we were to look at a lot of easily available or long-standing science around endurance sport, you need a lot of carbohydrate. And you've got to have this much carbohydrate per hour, and etc. And that's the only way you can do it. Whereas if you step outside of that, you now come to the world of n equals 1, as in you're simply testing yourself. I find a lot of people in our experience, a lot of athletes are scared of that, because science is, science has authority. It says something else. Doing something on your own is crazy, but it's not if you apply consciousness, which is where your whole journey starts. Because if you're conscious of how you feel and mindful of the goal you want, and you're able to assess your own results, well, if you're seeing an improvement, even if science says you should not be seeing an improvement, well, hell, there's a lot of things that science says. It says you need this much carbohydrate. If you try and force that much down, a lot of people are going to get very sick, but no one questions the fact that the science might not be helping them there. In this case, the n equals 1 experiment of yourself can help you, and that was able to, obviously, that experiment, you saw results you really like, so you want to keep going with that, right?
Yeah, I think you highlighted some great points, and I think that the other thing that I'll see often is, see the question come up. It's like, well, where are all the Olympic records and Olympic medals on a high-fat approach? And, my first thought is there's a beautiful moving of the goalposts if we're talking about ultra endurance events, because like I said earlier, like the 5K at the Olympic Games is a drastically different event in many ways than a 24-hour or a 100-mile is. And I mean, even when we look at the science itself, one of the guys I really appreciate and look to is a guy out of Canada named Trent Stallenworth. He works with like nutrition and exercise phys with the Canadian Olympic track and field team, and he's very much high carb with his athletes, but he is open-minded to the degree of periodizing your nutrition to a degree, as well as what event are we talking about. I remember in 2013 when I did the Desert Solstice Track Invitational for the first time and ran 11 hours and 47 minutes for 100 miles and then hit 101.7 miles for 12 hours. It was like I think, a matter of weeks before I had an email from him. And I had never met the guy before. An email from him. He wanted to know exactly what I was doing. And because he heard all the stories of this guy's a keto athlete, and in his mind, he was thinking, well, the science is pointing the other direction. Certainly in 2013, it's pointing the other direction. So I want to know what this guy is doing as opposed to just dismissing what I was doing. And when I explained to him kind of how I set up my approach, and he realized it wasn't just this plug and play 30 grams of carbs per day year round, he was like, okay, well, that in theory makes some sense. And since then, we've had enough kind of early studies into the kind of a high fat, low carb approach into endurance to recognize that it seems like on paper, when you're at a level of like a 65% VO2 max to 70% VO2 max, it could, you can make the argument as the distance gets long enough, it starts to become a fair bet that could be a useful performance tool, if not an improved performance tool, especially as you get into some of these multi-day events or going past 24 hours. I think Trent, if I remember what he said most recently, was once you start getting up to 10 to 12 hours on paper, it starts to look like there's some efficacy to a high fat, low carb approach. And I mean, from my experience, I would agree. I think like if I were to train for, say, a 5K or a 10K and try to meet my full potential in that event, I think, personally, I think there's a way to do a higher fat approach with that, but it would be different than the one I'm doing for 100 miles. And that's where I think a lot of people miss the boat, is they don't want to kind of really unpack things down to the very last detail of what they're actually training for. They want to, look at someone doing a 5K, or if they're doing the 5K, look at someone doing a 100-mile. And then we just get a lot of confusion, a lot of muddied water. So then when someone isn't familiar with the approach and starts looking at it, they see all these polarizing opinions and all these very different outcomes. Like they might talk to one friend who thinks it's the best thing ever invented, and then another friend thinks it like literally almost put them in their coffin. So and I think there is some validity to just it working a lot better for some folks versus other, and whether that's an application error or just a personal individualized situation is anyone's guess, and it's probably a variety of both depending on who you're talking to.
I think you're right. There's definitely, different people will respond to different things, and also if you were to get strict with something and have people who are not getting the results they want, whatever they're doing nutritionally, to keep a food diary, then a good portion of the times you're going to find out that actually there are things in there that are not ideal. It doesn't matter what protocol or nutrition approach you're following. Junk is junk. The wrong food at the wrong time is the wrong food at the wrong time. Dinner at midnight is never going to help you run at 5 a.m., whatever it may be. Then sometimes people are not helping themselves. But the most important thing, I think, is if you're mindful about it. And what I really like about your approach is, on the one hand, you can be very easily, he's that keto guy who does 100 miles and is super fast on it, but you are not dogmatic about keto or anything else. Your own use of carbohydrates is applied up and down depending on what race and what goals you have. And, it presumably, all of this is only led by the fact that you personally feel a benefit in performance. The day you stop feeling a benefit from performance doing this is the day you go and find a different way of doing it, right?
Yeah, and that's what I tell folks too, is like I do have the luxury of racing in college and high school and post-college at more traditional distances. I've done every workout, every track workout, every cross-country workout, every hill workout. So I know like some of where, like I know where my peak performances are at when I'm there. And like had I found out that, this key workout that I need to be able to execute in order to be ready for a 100-mile race, all of a sudden I can't do that to the level I need to based on my nutrition, that would be the day that I switched my nutrition. So like, the proof is in the pudding, or the proof is in the data. And, if someone tells me, your tempo runs are going to suffer from, a high fat, low carb approach, and then I go out and I run one of the best tempo runs of my life following a low fat or a high fat, low carb approach, it's like, who do I believe at that point? Do I trust my body, or do I trust the people who are telling me that it shouldn't happen? And I mean, you have to be careful with that too. You obviously want to be honest with yourself and be aware of like certain nuances. I mean, the placebo effect is a real thing, but my counter to that is an 8-year placebo effect seems like an awfully long placebo effect. The relative lack of swelling in my legs post workouts, post big training blocks, post airplane flights, post big races is another big thing that I've noticed from, keeping the carbs at a lower rate. And also, like you said, not being dogmatic about it. One of the things I'll sometimes see is I'll get roped into a conversation where one guy's saying like, okay, here's Zach eats like next to no carbs or zero carbs. And then the other person's like, no, he's a carb burning athlete because on his race, he took in a gel or, a sports fuel. Or I saw him take a sip of Coke at that aid station at mile 56 or something like that.
Yeah,
And
you should just be eating a spoon of coconut every 20 miles.
yeah.
That's it, right? Otherwise, you're not burning fat.
Yeah, so it is really interesting, and usually what I end up is telling folks is like, here's the way to look at it. If you look at my year, 365 days as an average, I probably average around 10% carbohydrate intake. When you add in and average out my lowest carb days and my highest carb days, that doesn't mean that every day it's 10% carbohydrate. What it means is there may be some days where it's 30% carbohydrate, and then there might be another day where it's literally zero.
Yeah.
And it just all averages out to that. So if you want, you can put whatever label you want on it, but that's kind of where it's at, and kind of where I operate. And I don't see carbs as like this demon thing. I look at it a lot more like caffeine, where like I think it can be a very good performance enhancer when used right. And if you put yourself in a position to be able to minimize the amount you need for the maximum return, for me, that's the sweet spot. So if I can get the same output at 20% carbohydrate as I was getting when I was eating 60 to 70%, for me, that's a win. And my body has seemingly been telling me that for the better part of 8 years. So that's just where I try to focus my energies and my kind of approach to a lot of these races these days.
Yeah, no, I mean it's well, obviously it's working, and the thing I would like to just break out for anybody who's less familiar with the keto, the fat burning, the fat adaptation, I wondered if you could just give us a quick potted summary of what fat adaptation is, and just the terminology: fat adaptation, ketosis, ketogenic diet. What is fat adaptation, and why does it matter for an athlete? And if you did want to benefit from it, how would you go about it? Just sort of quick,
Yeah, so
a 101 on switching from, I've never heard of this concept before. What is it? How does it work? And how could I go about it if I'm interested?
So I think like fat adapted or fat adaptation is kind of like a difficult one, because if you ask like the real strict scientists, they might even say like, what do you even mean by that? It's not even well defined. And they're probably right, because I think it can be like a moving target depending on your goals. If you're looking at the keto world, there's some determining or some definitions that people tend to gravitate to. If you're willing to test blood ketone levels, usually they say like if you're at 0.5 millimoles or higher, you've entered ketosis at least to a small degree, and the higher that number gets, the higher amount of ketone bodies you're finding in your blood.
And
Is
just by entering ketosis there, but by that is, you are predominantly fueling your activity from stored body fat as opposed to stored carbohydrate.
To a degree, like I could follow a zero carb diet and that wouldn't necessarily be the case. It's more indicative of what intensity I'm doing. So I could get as quote unquote fat adapted as humanly possible for me. And if I go and do like some real glycolytic workouts, like 100-meter sprints, or get on like the rowing machine or like a Compex 2 trainer, something like that, where like I'm just like going super hard for like 10 to 60 seconds, I'm going to go glycolytic even if I'm zero carb intake. My body's just they're going to pull glycogen from my muscles, which are going to be my liver and muscles, which are going to be replenished through fats and proteins, likely at a slower rate. And then it just becomes a question of, well, are you going to deplete your glycogen stores during that workout? And if the answer is no, and you have enough time between the workouts to replace that stuff to a level that is high enough for you to do another workout when you're ready to do it, through fats and proteins, then you can probably make that work. Doesn't mean it's the only way you have to go about that. Uh, so I actually, when it gets to fat adaptation within extreme endurance, I'm more inclined to have someone do a field test, because this is going to be kind of, I think, more indicative of whether it's going to be a useful, or whether the approach they're doing is working or not, as versus going in and saying, oh, well, my blood ketones are at 1.0 or something like that. Is what I'll do is, once we get to like a point in the season or the training block where they're doing a substantial enough long run, so we start dividing it into two categories. And one category is your fat adaptation field test. So if I send someone out for a 5 hour run and they feel like their energy levels are solid at that long run intensity with just water and electrolytes, then you're fat adapted enough. You don't need to get more fat adapted, because the reality is we can fuel during a race. Now, if there was a 100-mile race where there was a rule, you just can drink water and electrolytes, in that case, we're getting as fat adapted as possible.
So basically, just to unpack that one quickly, that's talking about a field test, 5 hour run, steady pace, not taking anything on board, right? Because you're just fueling from what the body already has, isn't it? And we're not talking about the 2 hour carb store that's going to be depleted, because that's not even what you're fueling from in the first place. You're getting the fuel from the stored fat. That 5 hour period, you don't need to take anything else on apart from water and electrolyte.
Yeah, and I think like that's just more useful knowledge to me, because that's going to be the environment you're in when you're racing. Like, you could go into a lab and get things tested, and I think that could be some valuable information to have. I mean, I've done it before, and my results came back where my peak fat oxidation was 1.56 grams per minute. And if you look at the literature, that's like 50% higher than the max out of what they used to have in the literature. And I wasn't even the highest person that got tested that day. There was a guy who was at like 1.8. So like, you can get some more concrete data if you really want it, if you're willing to go into a lab and do some of those tests. But ultimately, like I was saying, if you can do that long run, that 4 or 5 hour long run with water and electrolytes and feel solid, you're probably fat adapted enough if that's the norm for you. Like, if you go out and do that once and have a good day, but then every other time you do it, you're bonking at hour 3, or you're starting to fade at hour 3. If you want to go the high fat, low carb approach, you probably have a little bit of work to do. But ultimately, what we're going to do is, once we identify that you are quote unquote fat adapted enough, we're going to move into a phase where, well, now what are you going to do during the race? So then it comes down to deciding what fuel you're going to take in during the event itself. And we're going to start playing around with that just to make sure it's going to work well for you, to make sure that you're not surprising yourself. It goes back to what you were saying earlier. Don't try anything new on race day. So like, when I set up a fueling strategy for myself or for a coaching client, we operate from a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C. And plan A is going to be something that's worked for you time and time again, rarely if ever failed on you. And that's going to be where we draw our primary approach from. But you're also going to have a plan B that you've tried occasionally and had some success with, as kind of like, this is what you're going to use if plan A stops working for whatever reason. And then plan C is a little more like, it's the harder conversation to have, because you don't necessarily want to put a negative seed in their mind, but it's like, if the wheels are coming off, or if something is not working the way that we thought, or you miss your crew at an aid station, like, what are you going to do in that situation? And usually I'll practice the plan A and the plan B to a degree with myself or the client during training, to make sure that those aren't going to like really surprise you, and then lean on the plan C as just so you know what to do if that situation would come up, as opposed to kind of running that through the training phases and things like that. But that's kind of how I divide it up with those long runs as you get closer to the race, is kind of those two categories of, here's the fat adaptation field test, and then here's the race day strategy field test. And that's usually what I find works best for me and for the folks I've worked with.
No, that sounds like a good solid way of putting a baseline in there, where also that smart move that the plan A, the plan B, I really like that, and the plan C, because if it does go south, it's like, you're out hiking in the middle of nowhere. You need to know that, well, if anything goes wrong, what's your way out? You can't see anything and you've got no map, and well, you're going to need something like that. And that just sounds really, really smart. But for people who are newer to the idea, might even think a 5 hour run sounds weird, or distinctly painful. Let alone the idea, if anyone was listening who thought 5 hours on no fuel must have been a human impossibility. I mean, I remember when I first came across the sort of whole fat adaptation concept, because I, like you in my own way, had that same, this is what I have to do. I have to take this many carbohydrates per hour, and I was forcing all this stuff down, and I was feeling very sick doing it and getting poor results. And that's kind of what leads to the genesis of starting 33, is that journey of, well, is there a better way? And not being able to find what we wanted. But as I went along that, I'm like speaking to different nutritionists, and I was a journalist at the time, so I had access to and was given very free access to a number of nutritionists from some of the very biggest sports nutrition companies in Europe, because they're very keen on the product placement, they're very keen to help. But I kept getting the same message: you've got to take this many carbs, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. I'm like, it keeps making me feel sick, it's not working. I get sick a lot, etc., etc. And they keep coming back with it. And it was only when I was doing a job with an Olympic cyclist at the time who told me he did 3-hour rides fueling on nothing, and I nearly fell over. I'd never heard of the concept before. I'm like, how can I have spent a year trying to solve a nutritional problem? I mean, this is what, 2008, 2009, and never have heard this concept. I mean, it wasn't like I was an expert at the time, but when he told me about that 3 hours on nothing, I was like, how is that even possible? And now, you would use a 5-hour run as a field test. But if people are looking at this, apart from thinking, well, I just get to carry less, what is the advantage in improving that fat adaptation so that you are able to fuel off your body's own reserves, rather than burning through that carb so quickly that at that 2-hour point, if you've been dependent on it, well, you're likely to hit the wall unless you keep forcing the stuff down, which in its own way can cause problems. What's the benefit in making that switch to get to a point where even a 2-hour run on nothing can be a normal thing for someone, let alone 5?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think 5 is definitely kind of the gold standard, in the sense that it's getting lengthy for a lot of folks. A lot of folks, certainly if they're not running ultra marathons, just won't be doing a 5-hour one. So you can make your own field test if you want. Let's say you're just doing, like, you're trying the approach out for lifestyle, and you want to know, like, if you're quote unquote fat adapted. Well, a good way to know that is, can you do, like, a 16-hour fasting window, or eventually maybe even a 24-hour fasting window, and not feel like you're just chomping at the bit, or angry and like irritable and super hungry all day long. Like, those are other signs just that are a little more approachable for someone who's not in the endurance world, to kind of see if they're where they need to be, as opposed to going back to, like what I said before, testing those blood ketones. But for the application within racing, I think especially when you get into extreme endurance or ultra marathon type stuff, it becomes a big individual component. Like, I mean, there's folks out there who can just shovel down 400 calories an hour seemingly and be no worse for the wear from the digestive standpoint. That person probably does not need to, like, focus on fat adaptation that much. If they don't want to. Like, I would make an argument that we should be very mindful of maybe what you're doing to your system if you're doing that on a regular basis. I can't necessarily point to anything that would incriminate that, like, long term for certain. I just know what it does to me. So you get people on the other end of the spectrum, though, where if they're hitting more than a gel an hour, stomach's going to turn on them eventually, and that person, they maybe have to consider a high fat approach just to be able to feel relatively decent on some of these events. So you have those two ends of the spectrum, and then everywhere in between. So ultimately you have to ask yourself, like, what kind of logistical hurdles do you want to try to get over from a fueling standpoint? And then what kind of logistical hurdles is the environment going to place on you that you can't control? So, like, one thing that is very clear is that if it gets hot, like if we have an event where it's going to hit triple digits or get really, really warm out, digestion becomes much more difficult in those scenarios. And I think even folks who are high carb are going to find themselves fueling less during those, or switching their fueling sources, or finding themselves in positions where it's kind of a coin flip as to whether they're going to find themselves puking up their nutrition at some point. Those are all things I think you want to consider. So, you won't see me telling a high carb athlete you need to switch if they're routinely putting away enough fuel to have strong races. And I also try to appreciate just the variance in people's ability to get fat adapted without a high fat, low carb approach. I mean, there's folks out there. I mean, the best example is probably Kilian Jornet. I think when he did his Mount Everest ascent, he did that on like 2 gels or something like that. And it's like, the guy's a high carb. He follows a high carb approach to nutrition, I'm next to certain. But for whatever reason, whether it be just the relative lifestyle he's lived since age 3 or whatever, is some genetic component. He's able to like kind of have a similar fueling strategy as I do on race day, but within the context of a high carb diet in his day-to-day life. So I try to appreciate there's folks like that out there too, who maybe don't necessarily need to alter their food intake as much as I did. But then there's going to be people on the other end of the spectrum who absolutely would benefit from it. And I think you ultimately have to take a close look at the person's needs, the thing they're trying to take on, the willingness and ability to adhere to a program. I can give someone a really, really detailed nutrition program for their training, kind of similar to what my approach is. But if they're not going to do it, then it's not going to be any benefit anyway. So there's a lot of, I think, when you really get down to the human element of it all, there's a lot of things to consider.
Yeah, but so balance it out with what are your goals, whether that's life, whether that's health, whether it's longevity, whether it's race performance, whether it's podiums, whatever it may be. How does your own personal attitude, your life, the pressures that you have within, whether it's within your training, your racing, your business, or your home life, how does that fit with you making a dietary change if you want to experiment with something? And just as a last one, as you're reducing carbs within your diet, you're compared to a standard American diet or even standard European diet these days. That's a big amount of carbohydrate that's coming out. You're replacing that with fat-heavy foods, with the idea behind that being the more fat the body consumes, the more used it gets to seeing that as fuel, the less likely it is to divert to burning carbs straight away, the more efficient an athlete you can become if it seems that the fat-burning sort of ketogenic approach is beneficial for you in your own experiment. Mm-hmm. But in your favorite go-to foods, you've got to put a good amount of fat on your plate for dinner or for a snack. What are the kind of things you're going for? And in terms of those big carb roadblocks that you see catching people out, what are the biggest wins they can get to quickly swap carbs out the diet for something with a bit more fat in it?
Yeah, a lot of times when we're kind of coming up with a plan, it's looking at like kind of what I said before, what's going to keep you on track versus keeping you from like staying on track for a little bit and then falling off the wagon altogether. And for me, that's been more, I may have had an easier route through that than some people because I just tend to have a more savory, salty tooth than a sweet tooth. So for me, when someone told me, you can have eggs and bacon for breakfast and steak for dinner, I was like, let's start. But someone else you might say that to, and they might be like, they might have a hard time with that. So it can be very individual. For me personally, like, I base a lot of my nutrition around like animal-based products, like fatty animal cuts of meat and stuff like that. I try to focus heavily on like local grass-fed, grass-finished beef. Not necessarily because I think the quality is that much better than a traditional one, but I do also understand that like whenever you can get something local, it's just going to be a smaller ecological footprint, and it's also going to be maybe like if you want to get into the ethical topic of it all, like an animal raised on grass its entire life, and then ultimately taken to slaughter to feed me is going to be. Like if you look at the number of cows I eat versus, the number of deer, squirrels, birds, and things that would get killed in a field if I ate monocropping vegetables all day long, like, you start to get into that rabbit hole, which, can get controversial and get very individual as well. But, for me, that's kind of what. It's an
interesting point, that, and not one I consider. I mean, I'm aware of the irony in some senses that industrial farming, for all its downsides, is efficient. So per head of cattle, there might be less, in some respects, less environmental damage. But the idea that the amount of other wildlife that will be killed to allow that cattle to roam, which is not happening on the individual, I'd never thought of that. I.e., for each cow that goes through the industrial system, well, there were, I don't know, 2 field mice, 3 squirrels, and half a deer that was taken out per head in order to give them their space. You're right, that's a huge rabbit hole that we could go down, and probably not the space for this podcast. It's just an interesting point. I'd never thought of that one.
I would just encourage anyone who's interested in that topic to check out Joel Salatin, the Polyface Farm. He essentially took a plot of land that was basically considered defunct from an agricultural standpoint and turned it into one of the highest, most productive plots of farmland available. In fact, if I remember right, what he told us when we did a podcast with him is his polyface farm is 5 times more productive than what the average productivity metric would be for a system like his in the United States. So if you're looking for the most ethical, most holistic approach where kind of like the plants and the animals and the soil microbiome all work together synergistically, and things tend to find the right place in life, that's a great spot to start. I would encourage anyone interested in that to just check him out and keep asking questions.
Yeah. No, I mean, interesting. I mean, there's so many other angles we could go into here, but I mean, we've covered so much already, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I really want to say thank you for making the time to come and do this. I'd love to do a follow-up at some point, whether we go deeper down the environmental rabbit hole on food, or whether we go further on running 100-milers. Or, I mean, there was a whole thing on gut health that I know you've written about on your blog. I might stick a link to some of the posts you put in there. That's a whole nother can of worms we can open. I think there's so much in that, both for health and performance, because really, frankly, they are the same thing. Whatever your goals are, you can't perform at your best unless you're healthy, and nutrition is a key part of that. And I think your approach just speaks so much to the value of finding what works for you and getting mindful of the results you experience, and following that path based on those results. I mean, it's done some incredible stuff for you, and I love that so it was an 11:47 100-miler the first time, in 11 hours 40 minutes next, and you reckon you've got another chunk to come off in the tank if you can get the day to come right, yeah?
Yeah, that's the goal. I think I feel like I'm a young 33, so I hopefully have a few more. And I'm motivated by guys like Jeff Browning, who's turning 48 this year and has spent the last 3 years finishing the top 5 at the Western States 100 as what a lot would consider an old man in the sport. So he follows a similar nutritional approach to I do. So if I follow the Jeff Browning blueprint, I've got 15 years of solid racing at least left.
And you are not even halfway through your ultra career.
Yeah, there you go.
Zach, thanks so much for making the time. We'll stick links to your site and stuff. Where's the best place for people to find you and to connect with you on social? We'll put all these in the show notes.
Yeah. If they're looking for a one-stop shop, if you go to my website, ZachBitter, ZachBitter.com, that's got links to my Instagram, Facebook, Twitter there, as well as any coaching consult opportunities. If you don't like websites, my most probably used social media platform is Instagram, and that's just at ZachBitter there, Twitter at ZBitter. So reach out if you have any questions. I'd be happy to interact.
Lovely. Zach, thanks so much for this. And I hope it's less than another 3 years before I bump into you on the Western States Trail again. Yeah,
absolutely. You'll have to let me know when you're stateside, and I'll let you know if I'm ever out your way.
No, do that. Yeah, if you want some really flat canals around London, I know most of them.
Okay, good deal.
Thanks so much.
All right, take care.
Cheers, man. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, what do you think? Mr. Zach Bitter, give that man a great big 33 hand. What an absolute rock star. If you fancy running 100 miles, if you fancy improving your own fat burning abilities, well, get stuck in. Let us know how you get on. Let us know what you thought of the show. Have you tried any ketogenic diet stuff yourself? Have you tried any other experiments of one that have improved your performance? Let us know what your journey's been. You can do that in the show notes below. You can leave comments. You can contact us on our social media. That's all down there below. You can even drop us an email. You'll find it all in the notes under this show. So look, thanks very much for giving up your precious time to share it with us, and in this case with Mr. Zach Bitter. We look forward very much to seeing you and being with you on the next episode of the show. And in the meantime, if you are looking to fuel your performance with the best possible natural sports nutrition, well, of course, there is only one place you could possibly be going, and that is 33shake.com. Thanks very much. Catch you on the next one.